The night sky over Washington City glowed with an eerie and terrifying orange light on August the 24th in the year 1814. Flames licked the sides of the Capitol building and smoke billowed into the humid summer air as British troops marched through the muddy streets of the young American capital. The sound of shattering glass and crumbling masonry echoed through the night, while citizens fled into the surrounding countryside in a panic. This was not merely a military defeat, but a symbolic crushing of the American spirit by the most powerful empire on earth. The very heart of the United States government was burning to the ground, and the experiment of democracy seemed poised to turn into ash and ruin before it had truly begun. Inside the president's house, which would later be known as the White House, chaos reigned as the First Lady Dolly Madison scrambled to save national treasures. With the British Army only miles away, she refused to leave until the large portrait of George Washington was unscrewed from the wall and secured for transport. She understood that this war was about more than territory or trade rights. It was a battle for the existence and legitimacy of the nation itself. If the symbols of the Republic fell into enemy hands, the morale of the American people might never recover. Her carriage sped away just moments before British soldiers entered the mansion to feast on the dinner left behind before setting the structure ablaze. James Madison, the fourth President of the United States and a primary architect of the Constitution, watched the destruction from a distance with a heavy heart. He was a man of intellect and laws rather than a military commander, yet he found himself leading a fractured nation against the might of Great Britain. The war had been declared 2 years prior under his guidance, but the conflict had been plagued by incompetence and political division. Now, with the capital in ruins and the government in exile, Madison faced the darkest hour of his presidency. The man who had meticulously designed the framework of the American government now had to wonder if that government would survive the week. The stakes could not have been higher for the young republic, as the war threatened to undo the victory of the American Revolution. The British Empire was not just burning buildings, they were challenging the sovereignty of the United States on land and at sea. They sought to restrict American trade and check the westward expansion that many citizens felt was their destiny. A loss in this conflict would mean returning to a state of subservience to the British Crown, or perhaps the total dissolution of the Union. The war was a crucible that would determine if the United States was a permanent fixture on the world stage, or merely a temporary rebellion destined to fail. Tensions had been simmering for years before the first shots were fired, as the Royal Navy acted with impunity on the high seas. British warships frequently stopped American merchant vessels to search for deserters, but often kidnapped American citizens to force them into service. This practice, known as impressment, was a direct violation of American sovereignty and a source of immense outrage across the United States. Thousands of sailors were taken from their ships and families forced to fight for a king they did not serve. The British government refused to acknowledge American naturalization laws, claiming that anyone born a British subject remained one for life, regardless of their new citizenship. The situation reached a boiling point with the Chesapeake Leopard affair in the year 1807, just off the coast of Norfolk, Virginia. The British warship HMS Leopard hailed the American frigate USS Chesapeake and demanded to search the ship for deserters. When the American commander refused, the Leopard opened fire, killing 3 sailors and wounding 18 others before seizing 4 men. This act of aggression in American waters infuriated the public and led to calls for immediate war. President Thomas Jefferson opted for economic sanctions instead of military retaliation, but the memory of the incident lingered like a festering wound in the national psyche, setting the stage for the conflict to come. Economic warfare proved disastrous for the United States, as the Embargo Act of 1807 choked American commerce rather than punishing Britain. Merchants in New England watched their ships rot at the docks, while the economy plummeted into a deep depression. The policy was intended to starve Britain of American goods, but the British simply turned to other markets in South America. The failure of peaceful coercion convinced a new generation of politicians that honor and independence could only be maintained through force. These young leaders, known as the War Hawks, began to dominate Congress with their fiery rhetoric and demands for a confrontation to restore national pride and free trade. While maritime grievances dominated the headlines in the east, a different threat was growing on the western frontier. Settlers pushing into the Ohio Valley faced stiff resistance from Native American tribes who watched their ancestral lands disappear treaty by treaty. A visionary Shawnee leader named Tecumseh rose to power with a plan to unite the disparate tribes into a single great confederacy. He traveled from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, urging warriors to set aside their old rivalries and stand together against the encroaching white settlers. Tecumseh saw the British in Canada not as masters, but as necessary allies who could provide the guns and supplies needed to halt American expansion. The brother of Tecumseh, known as the Prophet, provided a spiritual foundation for this resistance movement at a settlement called Prophetstown. He preached a rejection of white culture and alcohol, urging his followers to return to their traditional ways of life to regain the favor of the Great Spirit. This religious revival attracted warriors from many nations, creating a formidable force in the Indiana Territory. The governor of the territory, William Henry Harrison, viewed this confederacy as a dire threat to the safety of settlers. In November of 1811, Harrison marched his troops to Prophetstown, leading to the Battle of Tippecanoe, where the native forces were dispersed and the village burned. News of British weapons found on the battlefield at Tippecanoe inflamed the war hawks in Washington, who were led by Henry Clay of Kentucky and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. They argued that the British were inciting Native American violence on the frontier, and that the only way to secure the West was to drive the British out of Canada entirely. To these men, the conquest of Canada seemed like a simple matter of marching north. They believed the Canadian population would welcome the Americans as liberators, and that the British garrisons were too distracted by the war with Napoleon in Europe to offer significant resistance. This overconfidence would prove to be a costly mistake. President James Madison finally bowed to the pressure and sent a war message to Congress in June of 1812, listing impressment and frontier agitation as primary causes. The vote for war was the closest in American history, reflecting the deep divisions within the country. The representatives from the South and West voted largely in favor, while the maritime states of New England were staunchly opposed. On June the 18th, the United States officially declared war on the British Empire. It was a bold move for a nation with a tiny navy and a small, ill-equipped army to challenge the mistress of the seas, but the die was cast. The United States was woefully unprepared for the conflict it had just initiated, with a regular army of fewer than 7,000 men. The senior commanders were aging veterans of the Revolutionary War who had not seen combat in decades and were often too infirm to lead effectively. The state militias were poorly trained and undisciplined, with many refusing to march outside the borders of their own states. Logistics were a nightmare as there were few roads to the frontier, and the government lacked the funds to supply the troops properly. The War Department had no centralized staff system to coordinate the complex movements required for a multi-pronged invasion of Canada. The opening campaign of the war was a disaster for the Americans, as General William Hull led an army from Detroit into Canada. Hull was a cautious and timid commander who was terrified of the Native American warriors rumored to be gathering in the woods. He hesitated to attack the British fort at Malden and eventually retreated back to the American side of the river without achieving anything. His indecision allowed the British commander Isaac Brock to seize the initiative. Brock was a brilliant and aggressive officer who understood that he could use psychological warfare to defeat a superior force. Isaac Brock formed a crucial alliance with Tecumseh, and together they devised a plan to bluff the Americans into submission. They marched their smaller force towards Detroit, while Tecumseh had his warriors parade through a clearing multiple times to create the illusion of a vast army. Brock sent a letter to Hull warning that he would not be able to control the native warriors once the fighting began playing on the American general's deepest fears. The ruse worked perfectly as the terrified Hull surrendered the fort and his entire army without firing a shot. It was a humiliating start to the war for the United States. While the land war sputtered, the tiny United States Navy provided a glimmer of hope with a series of shocking victories at sea. The frigate USS Constitution, commanded by Isaac Hull, spotted the British warship HMS Guerriere in the Atlantic Ocean in August of 1812. The British captain was confident of victory, but the American ship was heavier and better built with a hull made of dense live oak. As the British cannonballs bounced harmlessly off the sides of the American ship, a sailor reportedly shouted that her sides were made of iron. The Constitution dismasted the Guerriere in a close-range slugging match that stunned the British Admiralty. The legend of Old Ironsides was born, and the victory set off a wave of celebration across the United States. It proved that American ships and sailors were the equal of the vaunted Royal Navy in single-ship actions. Other American frigates like the USS United States, commanded by Stephen Decatur, soon followed suit with victories of their own. Decatur captured the HMS Macedonian and brought the prize ship back to an American port as a trophy. These naval triumphs did little to alter the strategic balance of the war, but they provided a massive boost to morale and forced the British to treat the American Navy with newfound respect. The war on the frontier turned bloody in the year 1813 as the Americans tried to recover from the loss of Detroit. A detachment of American troops was defeated at Frenchtown, and many of the wounded were killed by native warriors in the aftermath. This event became known as the River Raisin Massacre, and the cry "Remember the River Raisin" became a rallying slogan for American forces in the West. The brutality of the frontier war hardened the resolve of the soldiers, who were determined to avenge their fallen comrades. The conflict in the Old Northwest was becoming a war of extermination with no quarter asked or given by either side. Control of the Great Lakes was essential for any successful invasion of Canada, so the Americans began a frantic shipbuilding race on Lake Erie. A young naval officer named Oliver Hazard Perry was given command and tasked with building a fleet from scratch in the wilderness. He oversaw the construction of ships using green timber and floated them over sandbars to get them into deep water. By September of 1813, Perry had a squadron ready to challenge the British for control of the lake. The two fleets met in a violent engagement where the roar of cannons drowned out the sound of the wind and waves. During the battle, Perry's flagship, the USS Lawrence, was battered into a floating wreck by the British guns. With his ship sinking and most of his crew dead or wounded, Perry refused to surrender. He grabbed his battle flag, which bore the dying words of Captain James Lawrence, "Don't give up the ship," and rode through a hail of gunfire to the USS Niagara. Taking command of the fresh ship, he sailed back into the British line and forced their surrender. Perry scribbled a hasty note to General William Henry Harrison, stating simply, "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." The victory on Lake Erie cut the British supply lines to Detroit and forced them to retreat eastward into Canada. General Harrison pursued them with a large army of regulars and Kentucky militia eager for a fight. The British and their native allies made a stand near the Thames River in October of 1813. The American cavalry charged through the British lines, causing them to collapse quickly. In the ensuing chaotic fighting, the great leader Tecumseh was killed. With his death, the dream of a unified Native American Confederacy died as well, and the tribal alliance crumbled, leaving the Northwest firmly in American hands. While the North saw victories, the South was embroiled in a brutal conflict known as the Creek War. A faction of the Creek Nation known as the Red Sticks, inspired by the teachings of Tecumseh, attacked American settlements. A fiery Tennessee militia general named Andrew Jackson led a campaign to crush the Red Stick resistance. Character Bible: Andrew Jackson is a tall, gaunt man with a shock of stiff iron gray hair and piercing blue eyes, wearing a dark blue military uniform with gold epaulets and a high collar, standing with a rigid posture. Jackson proved to be a ruthless and energetic commander who drove his men as hard as he drove himself. The campaign culminated at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, where Jackson effectively broke the power of the Creek Nation. The year 1814 brought a terrifying shift in the war, as Napoleon Bonaparte was defeated in Europe and exiled to Elba. The British Empire could now turn its full attention and vast military resources toward the United States. Thousands of battle-hardened veterans from the Peninsular War were shipped across the Atlantic to punish the upstart Americans. The British plan involved a three-pronged attack from Canada in the north, New Orleans in the south, and the Chesapeake Bay in the center. The American government, which had struggled to fight a distracted Britain, now faced the full wrath of the conquerors of Napoleon. A massive British fleet entered the Chesapeake Bay in the summer of 1814, terrorizing the coastal towns and plantations. The British commander Admiral George Cockburn took particular pleasure in burning American property and liberating enslaved people to join his colonial marines. The target was Washington City, and the British landed a force of 4,000 regulars to march on the capital. The American defense was hastily organized and relied heavily on inexperienced militia. The two forces met at Bladensburg, Maryland, just outside the city limits, in a battle that would prove to be a national embarrassment. The Battle of Bladensburg was a rout as the American militia broke and ran almost immediately upon seeing the disciplined British lines. The retreat was so disorganized and rapid that the British jokingly referred to it as the Bladensburg Races. Only a small contingent of sailors and marines stood their ground, but they were eventually overwhelmed by superior numbers. The road to Washington was now wide open and undefended. President Madison and his cabinet were forced to flee into the Virginia woods, leaving the capital city at the mercy of the invaders. British troops marched into Washington City that evening and set about systematically destroying the public buildings. They piled furniture into the center of the House of Representatives and set it on fire, creating a blaze so hot it melted the glass skylights. The White House was next, as soldiers drank the president's wine before torching the mansion. The glow of the fires could be seen for miles, and it seemed as though the American government was being erased from the map. It was a moment of profound humiliation for the United States, but nature would soon intervene in a dramatic fashion. The day after the burning, a massive hurricane struck Washington City, extinguishing the flames and killing British soldiers with falling debris. The storm was so violent that it actually spun cannons around and ripped roofs off of houses. A tornado touched down in the center of the city, adding to the chaos and forcing the British to retreat to their ships. The storm saved the rest of the city from destruction, but the damage to the national pride was done. The British fleet then turned its attention north toward the wealthy port city of Baltimore, which they referred to as a nest of pirates. Baltimore was a different target than Washington, as the city had been preparing for an attack for months. The citizens built extensive earthworks and sank ships in the harbor to block the approach of the British fleet. The defense was anchored by Fort McHenry, a star-shaped fortress guarding the entrance to the harbor. The British landed troops to attack the city from the land, while their warships moved into position to bombard the fort. The American defenders at Baltimore were determined not to repeat the disgrace of Bladensburg and stood ready to fight to the death. The British fleet began a ferocious bombardment of Fort McHenry on September the 13th, raining rockets and mortar shells onto the defenders. The British guns had a longer range than the American cannons, so the fort had to endure the pounding without being able to fire back. For 25 hours, the sky was filled with exploding shells and red glare. A young lawyer named Francis Scott Key watched the bombardment from a truce ship in the harbor, anxiously waiting to see if the flag would be lowered in surrender. The fate of the city and perhaps the nation seemed to hang in the balance. When the sun rose on the morning of September the 14th, the smoke cleared to reveal a massive American flag, still waving defiantly over the fort. The British had failed to destroy the defenses or force a surrender, and realized that taking Baltimore would be too costly. They abandoned the attack and sailed away, leaving the city jubilant. Francis Scott Key was so moved by the sight of the flag that he wrote a poem titled Defense of Fort McHenry, which would later be set to music and become the national anthem. The defense of Baltimore was a turning point that restored American pride. While the British were being turned back at Baltimore, another invasion force was moving south from Canada toward New York. The British hoped to seize control of Lake Champlain and split the New England states from the rest of the Union. The American naval commander Thomas Macdonough positioned his ships in Plattsburgh Bay to wait for the British fleet. In a cleverly fought battle, Macdonough used the anchor cables to spin his ship around to bring fresh guns to bear on the enemy. The British fleet was defeated, and the invading army was forced to retreat back into Canada, ending the threat from the north. Despite the victories, the war had taken a toll on the American economy and political unity. In New England, opposition to the war reached a critical level as delegates from 5 states gathered at the Hartford Convention in late 1814. They discussed amendments to the Constitution to limit the power of the federal government, and some radicals even discussed secession. The convention was a manifestation of the deep frustration felt by the commercial states, but it would prove to be a political disaster for the Federalist Party. They appeared unpatriotic and treasonous just as the news of victories began to arrive. Peace negotiations had been ongoing in the city of Ghent in Belgium for months, as weary diplomats tried to find a way to end the conflict. The British initially demanded large territorial concessions and an Indian buffer state in the northwest. However, the news of American victories at Baltimore and Plattsburgh, combined with the cost of the war, softened their demands. Both sides eventually agreed to a status quo antebellum peace, meaning that everything would return to the way it was before the war. The Treaty of Ghent was signed on December 24, 1814, ending the hostilities on paper. News of the treaty traveled slowly across the Atlantic Ocean by ship, so the armies in North America had no idea that the war was technically over. The British launched their massive invasion force against New Orleans in January of 1815, hoping to seize control of the Mississippi River. Defending the city was a motley force commanded by Andrew Jackson. Character Bible: Andrew Jackson is a tall, gaunt man with a shock of stiff iron gray hair and piercing blue eyes, wearing a dark blue military uniform with gold epaulets and a high collar, standing with a rigid posture. His army included regular soldiers, militia, pirates, free men of color, and Choctaw warriors, all united by a desire to stop the British. The British Commander General Edward Pakenham was confident that his disciplined veterans could easily sweep aside the ragtag American force. He ordered a direct frontal assault against the American earthworks on the morning of January the 8th. It was a suicidal plan, as the British troops had to march across an open field directly into the sights of the American riflemen and cannons. The fog that had covered the field lifted at the worst possible moment, exposing the British columns to a withering fire that cut them down in rows. The Battle of New Orleans was a lopsided slaughter, as the British suffered over 2,000 casualties in less than 30 minutes, while the Americans lost fewer than 100 men. General Pakenham was killed in the assault, and the survivors retreated in disarray. It was the most decisive American victory of the war, and it propelled Andrew Jackson to national stardom. Although the battle was fought after the peace treaty had been signed, it created the impression that the United States had won the war on the battlefield. The victory secured the Louisiana Purchase and ensured American control of the Mississippi. The end of the war brought a surge of nationalism and a sense of completeness to the American identity. The United States had fought the most powerful empire in the world to a draw and maintained its independence. The Federalist Party, which had opposed the war, collapsed in the wake of the Hartford Convention and the victory at New Orleans. The country entered a period known as the Era of Good Feelings, where political partisanship faded and a spirit of national unity prevailed. The war had proven that the Republic could withstand the crucible of conflict. The War of 1812 is often forgotten or viewed as a minor footnote in history, but its impact was profound. It broke the power of the Native American tribes in the East, clearing the way for rapid westward expansion. It spurred the development of American manufacturing, as the blockade forced the country to become more self-sufficient. Most importantly, it settled the question of American sovereignty once and for all. The United States was no longer an experiment, but a permanent nation that demanded respect from the powers of Europe. It was truly America's second war for independence.